Just a few short weeks into the 2022 short legislative session, and the close in May is already looming. With less time, there is increased pressure on lawmakers to accomplish all the things on their agenda. Joining the Municipal Voice today is House Minority Leader Vincent Candelora to discuss what he hopes to accomplish and how that legislation could affect towns and cities, and ultimately the citizens of Connecticut. We'd like to thank our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders.
Representative Candelora, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
It's been an unprecedented few years coming into this, and 2 legislative sessions now have occurred during the pandemic, going into the 3rd now. How do you prepare for this amongst uncertainty? Are there issues that you feel have been left on or off the table in this time?
Yeah, I think it's been a real challenge for us because the political arena is very much a people's business. So having that level of interaction is very important when we're crafting legislation, being able to hear from not just our constituents, but the people that are impacted by that legislation, whether it be a particular business or like an association. And so having sort of the virtual world has brought challenges. On the one hand, it's certainly opened up access for people to testify in legislation, but it's made sort of our legislation a global process now, as opposed to sort of a Connecticut-centric process. And so it is a challenge. As a leader, it's a challenge to try to pass legislation and disseminate the information to our members, because oftentimes when the building's open, people speak to each other. When it's all closed, you're relying on your leaders to sort of disseminate information. So it's sort of a game of telephone that we play as a kid that's a little dangerous. It's tough, and I'm really looking forward to reopening the building.
Definitely. Brian, have you noticed, has the pandemic changed the way you access speaking to lawmakers about the issues that are important to us? Has it changed your job?
That's one of the key issues, actually, is access. And I agree with Dan. I think one of the key things is that person-to-person interaction. There's a lot of times if a bill comes up and there might be a slight change that you need, you can at least address it right away. Now it's sending an email or text like, hey, can you talk? And that kind of thing. So it slows the process down. And I think sometimes if you don't get it early enough, some things that you didn't count for and unintended consequences can occur.
Yeah. So when you can see people in person, you can be a little bit quicker, a little bit more nimble on those things and really read the room a little bit easier, I imagine.
And we're getting better at it. I have to say, there was a little bit of a learning curve last year, but I think, this year, at least it's somewhat open, but at the same time, we hope that when the General Assembly goes more often to having their sessions, that we'll have access to the building and have an opportunity to talk to representatives and senators.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking about, looking to reopening and everything, it seems as if we're entering another phase of the pandemic, perhaps the tail end or an endemic phase. Has that influenced your thinking about what to concentrate on for this year?
Yeah, I think we've seen the pivot already. A lot of proposals that are coming out, we're no longer talking about vaccines. We're now shifting to the collateral issues, the collateral damage that have come out of the pandemic. In particular, how the kids have been impacted, mental health for adults as well as children, looking at substance abuse support, all of the things that naturally come out of isolation, as a result of long-term isolation. There's a lot more conversation. So we are starting to see a shift, and even a shift back to more of the global conversations that we normally have, looking at our transportation and infrastructure development. So hopefully we're seeing this pandemic end and start transitioning to the endemic.
Yeah, moving from, surviving the disaster to the recovery, and, so many of those things in recovery, I think, would be good for Connecticut, regardless of whether or not we've been through a pandemic, trying to improve the economy and education. So it's like getting back to the work, really.
That's right.
Now, I was going to say, just to add to
Right.
that, I think, some of the residual effects, particularly on our school children, is the fact that, we need to invest more in social and emotional learning. And I think that's going to be key, as they go through their educational career.
Yeah. Speaking of kids and schooling, that's been one of the big issues throughout this pandemic. Now it seems like we're getting to a point where masks are becoming optional around the state, so that kids will have better access to education. Do you think there's still a place for online virtual learning spaces for kids that can't attend in person, or for classes that might not be offered in their district?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was always a big proponent of online learning. At first, I actually had proposed it for the purposes of allowing people maybe in a rural district to take a physics class that isn't offered, or a certain language that may not be offered. And I think now what we're seeing is, as this pandemic ends, there are children that still can't go to school. There was a bill passed last year that puts hurdles for children that are not vaccinated to be in school. So I think that platform is needed for children that might be immunocompromised, or even take ill for a long period of time because of a cancer or something, to allow them to have access to online platforms. Massachusetts actually implemented it, and they utilized it throughout the pandemic. And we're not talking about a Zoom platform like we see here today. We're talking more of a robust online platform that uses certified teachers in Connecticut. Your diploma is sort of an online diploma. It's a statewide program. I don't anticipate it would be widely used, but I think it's something that we need to do, and the state is looking at that, and it's going to be a rollout probably over the next course of a couple of years.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be a really useful tool for educators to have in their toolbox, regardless of the pandemic, to be able to offer some of those programs, like you said, to kids that might not have physics in their town and other things like that.
That's right.
Now, Brian, maybe you could speak to this a little bit, but CCM has called upon the state to help keep our children safe by making bonds available to help repair HVAC systems and air filtration in schools. Even outside of the pandemic, this seems like common sense. There's asthma issues and stuff. Do you think there's any chance that there will be movement on this issue this year? Let's start with you, Rep, and then we'll go to Brian for add-on.
Yeah, I think it's a critically important issue. I mean, right now, the way our bonding works, it doesn't necessarily cover the replacements of HVAC. I think we have to look at the reimbursement rate, really incentivize our cities and towns to replace those systems, because not only is it important for air quality, a lot of these newer systems are more efficient as well. So long term, it will save our communities money, and also is better for the children's health. So I think you're going to see broad support for that type of proposal.
Yeah.
And just to follow up on what Republican leader Candelora just said, we're looking at it as a way to update systems and also be able to protect the health of the students and the teachers. And the fact that it isn't covered right now under the school construction grant program, we just want to clarify that and make sure that it's specific so that it'll be eligible for those kind of reimbursements. And I think the other thing that we're pleased with, and again, we don't know if it's enough money or not, but the governor did propose $90 million for HVAC upgrades within the budget that he presented a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting. I've been talking about this issue with other people on the show as we go along, and this is the first time Representative Candelora brought it up, that I thought about the fact that these systems are 20, 30 years old. They are very inefficient just from a electrical use standpoint. So the benefits to towns are not just the health and the whatever, but they're also straight up monetary, and that's an interesting thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that makes it really a win-win for people. And I know just my town went through it. They I think it was connecting to a sewer line, and a lot of that ended up being all local dollars, and they still done it anyway. But it's just a win-win for the state to step in and say, we'll help you replace it, because the way that the school construction grants are, if it's new construction versus a rehab, the reimbursement rates are different. So I think we should treat those systems that are dealing with air quality, treating it differently in a reimbursement rate, I think would go a long way to incentivize our towns to upgrade.
Yeah. So the way it is right now, it kind of incentivizes new construction over upgrading things.
It can. It would incentivize a new building, which would include a new HVAC system, and that's why towns delay. My daughter, we have a new high school going in my town, and my daughter has to wear coats into the classroom, and I think a lot of that was delayed because we were looking at a massive new construction project. If HVAC systems are reimbursed, at that same level, even if it was a rehab, the schools might have done it a lot sooner.
Yeah,
So
the considerations would be different going into that project. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think as we enter kind of our new normal here, inflation has become an issue. The House GOP has said that tax brackets must be indexed and adjusted accordingly so that taxpayers are not forced into a higher tax bracket because they are earning a higher salary. What kind of changes would you advocate for?
So what we want to do is sort of tie our tax brackets to inflation. Mm-hmm. So if you're earning $40,000 in 1980, $40,000 today is very different, yet you're being taxed at the same level. So what we would say is let's account for inflation. So people who might be getting raises that are keeping up with inflation, you're not necessarily better off. So you shouldn't be pushed into a higher tax bracket when in fact, the adjustments are just there for inflation. So rather than have our tax structure static, we would have those numbers increase along with inflation. And it's a similar concept to the way minimum wage has now been tied to inflation in the same way. As minimum wage increases, eventually, if those tax brackets aren't adjusted to inflation, government is going to take more money out of your paycheck, and it doesn't mean you're better off. So that's a proposal that we are looking to get passed this year.
Yeah, it's really the buying power of that dollar more than the number that's important to people.
And then if I could follow up, I know you also have interest in the personal property tax credit as well as small business tax reform. Can you expand on those?
Yeah, absolutely. The personal property tax credit, it was a credit. Every homeowner, I think, renter, car owner would get a $500 tax credit off of their bill based on just that ownership. So it wasn't income based. Over the years, as Connecticut got into financial straits, that was reduced and taken away. We'd like to restore it. We have so much money now in the coffers, and I think that middle class and while it's a broad-based tax relief, what it does is it relieves property taxes, and it also helps indirectly municipalities. The other area we have to look at is the Unemployment Compensation Fund. We borrowed almost $1 billion from the federal government. We can't have businesses pay all that money back. That's a huge burden. So we would like to see some relief go there. And then finally, we want to repeal the truck tax that has not yet been implemented. We talk about inflation and groceries increasing. We should not impose that truck tax because with the new passage of the infrastructure money from the federal government, the governor's proposed to have a state match of $70 million through bonding, that we should take a look at that and say, let's put the brakes on it for at least a couple of years as grocery prices are rising to try to prevent that inflationary impact from occurring because of that tax.
Yeah. Is there any concern that the Special Transportation Fund, regarding its solvency, would that impact that removing the trucker tax?
So it wouldn't. I don't think it would impact it over the next 5 years. But I think to that point, we also need to talk about implementing some sort of transit authority. I think we've got to have broad-based review, and we need the stakeholders. Our COGS involved, our unions involved that do the construction work, to look at the state and say what are the areas that need to be developed. Because part of the reason why we fell into insolvency is we create, the busway, in New Britain. That's heavily subsidized by the state of Connecticut. Shoreline East is heavily subsidized, up to 90%. So as we add these programs in, we have to recognize we've got to balance it because our operating costs keep going up. So I think a transit authority would be a good way to go to broadly look at these and spend the money accordingly so we don't end up in insolvency down the road. And now's the opportunity, because this money really has given us sort of a 5-year window to really plan.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
So you certainly gave us some ideas right there for some good ways to do some tax cuts. And Governor Lamont himself has also called for some tax cuts. Among them, as he's said, property tax credit is one of those, but also accelerating pension and annuity exemption from income tax, reducing motor vehicle property taxes. How do some of these other suggestions from the governor gel with your goals?
Yeah, so I agree. We also have a proposal to accelerate the phasing out the pension, essentially the retirement tax that we have. And I think that's an important measure to keep people in the state of Connecticut because our elderly population, they do provide an economic engine for the state as well. The other piece is on the governor's proposal with the car tax. I do have a little bit of concern on that proposal, and I'll explain why. Right now, we have the municipal revenue sharing account where some of our sales tax money goes into that fund and is distributed to our municipalities. This year, there was supposed to be an excess payment that was distributed to our municipalities. That is being withheld. And so my concern always with the way things are structured for our cities and towns, that revenue stream is always the first stream that sort of gets held back, whether it's good times or bad times. And I think this is an example where we're in good times and that money isn't being dispersed. So taking a look at that car tax proposal, we would have to figure out a mechanism of how that money flows to our cities and towns, because we can't use it as a discretionary account for the state to keep it if they so choose.
I know the municipal revenue sharing is always an issue for us. Brian, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I was going to say, in particular, we're generally supportive of the motor vehicle tax cap at 30 or 29 mils, but at the same time, we're concerned that they're pegging it to a number that's a year earlier, so towns and municipalities might come up short as far as the funding source. And we are strongly against sweeping the funds or holding it back. If the money's in there, then we expect it to be distributed as the law prescribes.
So at TCM, of course, we think that towns and cities are burdened with an over-reliance on the property taxes. It's one of the things that makes it expensive to live here in Connecticut. Some of the stuff we've talked about certainly will help, but they won't necessarily do all of the work. We've called for revenue diversification and expanded shared and regional services. Do you think regionalization, revenue diversification can help alleviate some of these problems?
I think regionalization in general, our cities and towns do a good job on where they can regionalize, they do, and certainly continuing to help that. I think when it comes to education, when we're looking at regionalization with our education system, we need to improve the laws that govern those systems. Representing a district right now in Durham and Middlefield that share a school district, there's real challenges with the way their governing bodies operate and budgetarily that make it difficult. And we have to figure out ways to make that easier. Ultimately, I think the state of Connecticut needs to focus on properly funding education. It's become now the biggest burden on our cities and towns. And I do think it's an obligation of the state, not our cities and towns, to educate by virtue of the fact that our state board, our town board of education are really governed by the state, not our local municipalities. And that's because the structure was always there that the state needs to have more of a vested interest. And that's created the burden for our towns. I always get concerned about revenue diversification because it's just going to take more money out of people's pockets. And I'm a big fan, obviously, of our local municipalities. I think they do a better job with our dollars. There's a lot more accountability. Our local officials can't get out of town. They go and they go grocery shopping. They go to church. They're always accountable to their constituents. Hartford isn't, and I think that we need to fully fund that educational cost sharing And that would naturally alleviate the tax burdens on our local towns and cities.
So, Brian, why has CCM called for some revenue diversification?
We've called for it because of the property tax is a regressive tax. And I think what we're looking for are just alternative revenue sources so we can better balance our budgets. And I understand where Vin's coming from as far as, you don't want to just increase taxes. I think the idea there is to make it easier to share services and create efficiencies and save money and provide better delivery of those services. And I think, one of the avenues that we're looking at, for instance, last year we were able to pass legislation that establishes stormwater authorities. This gives towns the ability to set up a stormwater authority in order to offset the costs for what we call the MS4 permits, environmental permits, because right now it's sort of this is more of a federal state unfunded mandate, and we're just trying to be able to at least manage our costs that are mandated upon us. And I think going back to again what Vin said as far as education, I think what we're looking at is where can we regionalize services as far as special education? Can we set up regional centers of excellence in regards to special ed? This is the biggest spike that we're seeing in our local budgets, and it's an area that I think what we alluded to earlier with some of the social and emotional learning, as well as early intervention. These can actually save money upfront costs, but also save money in the long run and produce better outcomes for what we're our people of Connecticut are expecting. And I think just one final thing, and Ben might not know this yet, but we actually formed a special subcommittee within CCM to look at how the regional governance of regional boards of education. And I'm happy and pleased to say that Laura Francis, the first select woman of Durham, is actually the chair of that, and it's called for that. We won't have anything this legislative session, but the idea is that they're going to meet. They already started talking about it, but they're going to start meeting throughout the year, and next year we'll have a legislative proposal for you to consider.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's critically important as towns do look to regionalize as our population is shrinking, for our young children. And I agree with you on the special ed. We've got to look at it statewide and provide that funding statewide, as opposed to, towns inadvertently becoming the winner or losers depending on who is moving into their communities. It really could shoot up special education costs, and it becomes divisive, I think. If we were funding it statewide, that issue wouldn't be there.
Representative Candelora, you've spoken recently in the news and stuff about government accountability, the school construction program, and some of the needs for audits of some of these things. Can you speak a little bit to some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, as we've seen, the state has been hit with a black eye in a federal investigation over school construction and how that process has been worked. There's some accusations of cities and towns felt like they were forced to use certain contractors. And so we would like to take a look at how that whole system is. Number one, how did it come to be that we had a branch of an agency move from one department to another through a memorandum of understanding? I want us to look at that process. How many more of those type of structures are out there? And shouldn't the legislature have a role in blessing that or rejecting that when the executive branch wants to make a change that's contrary to statute? The other thing is we need to do an audit of our school construction to make sure that the decision makers are making the decisions that are best for Connecticut. Obviously we want to have the most efficient costs, and there's just some real questionable activity of companies that were on that bid list and how they were overlooked to the benefit of one other company. And I think it's important for people to go through that process because the public trust is critical. People need to know that their tax dollars are being spent correctly. And so when the day is done, if there was no wrongdoing, that's fine. But I think we have to set up a process to bring confidence back to the people.
Yeah. Brian, is this something that your department has tackled much yet, some of these issues? Do we have any positions on any of these?
Right now, I was going to say right now we're currently following it. These revelations came up at the same time as, Republican leader Candelora had, found them. February 2nd was a big day as far as shedding light on what occurred. And I think from our process, we're looking for efficiency. We're looking for an effective school construction program, but at the same time, we don't want our Board of Ed members or school construction committees to be, basically, I don't want to say bullied, but at the same time, be steered toward one company over another. Again, there was anecdotally just listening to or reading what people responded to is that they, thought, okay, we should do this because the state's telling us to. And you really have to have that trust in the process. And I think, the more transparency that we can have in the process is better for everybody.
Moving on to something a little bit more exciting, positive, I guess, for us at CCM. We're holding an event called Representation Matters in 2 weeks from now. And it's geared towards increasing representation from all groups at the table in politics in Connecticut. We think civic engagement is very important. There's a proposal to raise lawmaker pay that has bipartisan support. Do you think that this would help our legislature become as diverse as our state?
Well, I think that right now, having served now for, I guess, 15 years, there hasn't been a pay increase in over 21 years, I believe. People think that we're making a lot of money, and the base salary for a legislator is $28,000. And it was difficult for me back in 2006 when I decided to run. I have a family business. My brothers and sisters and my father said, "Don't you dare run." And of course, when your parent tells you something, no matter how old you are, you do the opposite. And it took them a number of years of me serving for them to buy into this. And it's been a burden on them. Yeah. So I'm fortunate that I was able to continue to serve in office, but far too often I'm watching good legislators say to me, "I just can't do this anymore. It's too demanding, and I need to go and find a full-time job that's making money." That's a problem when you start seeing people that are entering this field are individuals that might own their own business, so they have flexibility, or people that are living with their parents, frankly, and don't have a lot of overhead that they're able to run. That's not the diversity that we really need to be looking for. And so it's become a barrier to entry. And any job that has remained stagnant for 21 years with no pay increase, you have to wonder, is it worth it? And so I think I've seen there be a challenge. It's a barrier to entry. And I think, you sort of get what you pay for. So I think we should have that conversation. It shouldn't be a political football, and it always is. And so I might be an outlier in my Republican caucus feeling this way, but I think it's important we have this conversation.
Yeah. And I think that the general public, you hear, state representative, state senator, you think, oh, they're important people, they must be rich. But if they are, it's not from the pay, certainly.
And I like the citizen legislature. I like that it's part-time. I think the speaker made those same remarks. We're in agreement on that. The reality is it is a full-time job. But that part-time element, I think, is good because you want people with that perspective of, maybe somebody working as a nurse or somebody working as I do in the amusement industry. You get different perspectives. And that's the great thing about the citizen legislature in Connecticut as opposed to New York, which is a full-time legislature. So it's striking that balance because I wouldn't want us to end up with a full-time legislature. But if we don't address this issue, that may be where it ends up going.
Yeah. So keeping people, part of the appeal is keeping people connected to their communities, not a full-time political class or whatever that they, by nature of it, they have to be in touch with their communities.
I have to tell you one thing. I was the recipient of that, putting on my former hat, I was the recipient of that pay raise. And I remember at the time when I was considering running, I was like, ooh, I don't know if I could do that. And they're like, oh, we just passed a raise. And I was like, all right, maybe I can. But I also got out because at the time I had a growing family and I was like, I can't do this anymore. So I think Vince's points are well taken.
I've always valued your input and your perspective, but that's right. There's so many good people that had to get out because of the pay constraints.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
I always enjoyed serving with you too.
I
I'm
miss
glad you're
those
where you
days.
are.
All right. Speaking about, elections, people serving the states, it's been said that Connecticut has some of the most restrictive voting laws in America, according to some metrics, with Monty Frank, the independent candidate for lieutenant governor, saying that we're more restrictive than Georgia. You said that it's not a partisan issue, but you had some issues about how it was being introduced. Would a constitutional amendment be the correct way to go about this? And do you think it has a chance of going through?
Yeah, I think, Connecticut does have restrictive laws, and part of that is because of the Constitution. So in order to effectuate any kind of election reform, you have to look to the Constitution and try to change it. Roughly about 10 years ago, there was a measure on the ballot for no excuse absentee ballot voting, and it actually failed. The voters said, we don't want it. And that was a measure I think that I had voted for. The new one that's on the ballot come this fall is early voting. And, if that measure passes, my concern obviously is what impact it's going to have on our cities and towns if they have to man voting booths for a long period of time. It's going to cost them. So trying to, if it does pass, putting some guardrails on it to balance the needs of the voter versus the expense of our cities and towns to implement. But those reforms it's difficult because of the constraints of the Constitution. I do think there are some changes that are trying to be done statutorily. Last year, there was a bill that I had voted for that changed the AB process for our statute, which sort of mirrored the Constitution. But the devil is in the details of what that looks like. This year, the Democrats said they were going to e-cert the bill and rush it through without a public hearing. I was opposed to that process. Thankfully, they put the brakes on the e-cert. They're going to have a public hearing on it, and it will go through the process in the normal course.
Are there any other issues that you'd like to see tackled in this coming year? Something that might have been overlooked during the pandemic, kind of set aside, that you feel now needs full attention again?
Well, I think, getting back, I think there is an issue of transparency. There's this notion that the Zoom world gives people access. But I think we do need to look at some of our quasi agencies, especially the Port Authority, which was mired in some scandal that sort of it dissipated after the pandemic or during it. But we need to look at what level of openness, what level of freedom of information laws should be applying to our quasi agencies, so there is some level of transparency. I also think entering into this new age, we had a lot of no bid contracts out of necessity, buying up test kits or PPE or vaccine information, is looking at how we make that process more transparent without affecting the expediency. So whether they be published on a website or not, we're getting into the world of algorithms. So our taxpayers or constituents' information, how that gets protected, I think all needs to be looked at. And even the virtual world with local, cities and towns holding their virtual meetings, how does that look? How do we allow people to get into a room? Because the one-on-one interaction and in-person interaction, I think, is important as well. So I think those issues are going to need to be tackled too.
Yeah. Brian, is there anything else that your team's, concerned with in the upcoming session here?
I was going to say one of the issues that, that we're probably just as diverse in our opinions as the legislature and in particular the House Republican caucus, criminal justice reform. Do you mind, sharing the views of your caucus?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, I know one of the initiatives the governor has is trying to hire more police officers. We're concerned that some of the reforms are preventing officers from going into the force. The qualified immunity, what is the impact of that cost from an insurance perspective on our police officers individually and on our cities and towns? And I think the state needs to take a look at it. Also, in terms of criminal justice reforms, the catch and release with juvenile justice, the repeat offenders, how do we get our arms around that? As a state, we have an obligation to prevent the recidivism in our youth. I think children are now being recruited to commit crimes. We need to put all of that to an end for our cities and towns, because what we're starting to see now is the other impacts of people's insurance rates being increased, car insurance, their comprehensive actually being canceled after they've been a victim of car theft. All of those things impact, our communities, and I think we need to address it broadly. So I know the Judiciary Committee is raising that bill, and it's something that we really need to have that conversation, because public safety has really become a forefront issue.
And we have a task force on that, and we'll be submitting comments, but we're trying to work through the same issues that the legislature is. So I guess stay tuned.
More to come. Connecticut seems like it's in a better position today than it has been in a little while. Are you optimistic about the path that we're on?
So I am and I'm not. I'll say that we certainly, the volatility cap and the revenue cap was something that I always have pushed for, and I'm glad we have those implemented. So we're seeing our rainy day fund, upwards of $3 billion, and pension liabilities are being paid down. But what we have to look at, when those caps were put in place in 2017 from the bipartisan budget, our unfunded liabilities have grown from 75 billion to 95 billion. So the whole point of it was to try to pay down our debt, not increase it. So we have to have that conversation. Right now, the money is flowing in, but our credit card debt is increasing. And if we don't get a handle on that in the long run, we're not going to have that money to utilize on stuff like special education services. So it's a balance, and that's an issue that I've raised in this session as well for us to take a look at.
Excellent. Brian, any final thoughts you want to share?
I was just going to say, I think the unfunded pension liabilities, we're concerned that that's going to squeeze some of the discretionary funding, and in municipalities, cities, and towns, that's, we're considered discretionary. And when it comes to, the chopping block, sometimes we're first. And that's why, we're urging the legislature to tackle the unfunded liabilities.
Yeah. Well, it certainly sounds like both of you have your work cut out for you this session. House Minority Leader Vincent Candelora, thanks for speaking with us today. Brian O'Connor from our advocacy team, thank you for providing expertise.
We'd like to thank our guest, House Minority Leader Vincent Candelora. I'd like to thank our premier sponsors, Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks, who you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry draws on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.